So today we're going to be sharing the results and the products from the GEMS project, which was funded by the National Academy's Gulf Research Program. The project is a collaboration between the Hart Research Institute in Texas A&M, the Nicholas Institute at Duke University, the Nature Conservancy, and the Bridge Collaborative. Next slide, please. So I'm Lydia Olander from Duke University, and the other leads for the GEMS project are David Yaskowitz at the Hart Research Institute, Chris Shepard at the Nature Conservancy, and Heather Tallis from the Bridge Collaborative. Later today, you're going to hear from Katie Warnell at Duke University, and you'll meet some of the other team members in the breakout group discussions if you don't already know them. Next slide, please. So the motivation for this work started with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico just over 11 years ago. A series of National Academy science reports in the years after the spill emphasized the need for measuring the social and economic impacts of both the disaster itself and the restoration efforts designed to mitigate its effects. And that's what we're focused on in this project. Next slide, please. While there are billions of dollars that are being spent in the Gulf Coast restoration from now and into decades into the future, there's still no shared platform for assessing and reporting on restoration progress and effectiveness for the social and economic goals that are shared by many of the institutions that are working on restoration in this region. So we hope to lay the groundwork for just such a shared platform for restoration program managers and funders in the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide, please. So this project has been underway for 3 years. To start, we created conceptual models to identify the likely social and economic outcomes of different types of restoration projects taking place in the Gulf of Mexico. And then for each of the outcomes in those models, we then brainstormed an initial set of socioeconomic metrics. And then we refined those metrics with a lot of input from experts and practitioners. And finally, we developed a set of measurement protocols with details about methods and resources for measuring the social and economic metrics. And throughout this process, we incorporated feedback from experts, practitioners, and funders from around the Gulf and outside the Gulf when needed. Next slide, please. We applied this GEMS process to a variety of different restoration approaches used across the Gulf, including 7 different types of habitat restoration, which included a deep dive into different techniques for oyster reef restoration. Also included were projects for recreational enhancement, things like installing or updating recreational infrastructure like boat ramps, and improving water quality by applying green and gray infrastructure techniques to stormwater and wastewater management. Next slide, please. So why might you want to monitor or measure social and economic outcomes? There are a number of different reasons that we can imagine. First, starting with practitioners who are managing a restoration project, they might want to tell a more complete story about how the project is affecting the local community and economy, and therefore measure some of these outcomes to communicate that. They also might want to improve how they're communicating about the benefits of their project to new stakeholders, ones they don't usually communicate with about outcomes from their project that weren't necessarily their target, but other things or co-benefits that are coming out of their projects. The other group here is funders. Funders are also interested in collecting information on social and economic outcomes, and we're hearing this more and more from the funders that we've talked to. They want projects they fund to be able to report on these outcomes so they can do a number of different things. First is to better see the cumulative impacts of their programs across all the different projects. Another thing is to compare results across different projects and see how different types of projects are resulting in different kinds of outcomes. Third is learn from their current projects to improve future funding programs. And fourth is to justify their programs and how well they are doing at achieving these goals so that they can spend more in the future. The metrics we identified in the GEMS project could help here. In this example, the metric is number of recreational jobs created as a result of a project. The metrics for each of these project types were identified by using logic models that show which outcomes result from which restoration actions. And they clearly show that connection between the project, the outcome, and the associated metric. The slide shows one pathway in a logic model that traces how this management action, in this case, planting a new oyster reef, leads to changes in jobs, which is our metric here. A full model for a project would show all of the different human activities. These could be recreational, commercial, and subsistence harvest, efficient oysters, wildlife viewing, new educational and science activities, etc. and the related social and economic outcomes that would change significantly because of the project, such as jobs and labor income from the restoration and recreation activities, food security, cultural values, etc. And each outcome would have an associated metric. Next slide, please. Before we dive into the metrics themselves, I'd like to provide a bit of background on how we organize the metrics information. First, we have metrics for two different scales of assessment. First are project scale metrics. These are designed to be measured and reported by individual projects. They could be aggregated across projects to assess impacts for a region or a program, but they're measured at the project scale. The second are program scale metrics, and these look at cumulative or regional scale effects that are usually not detectable at the project scale and often need to be measured or modeled for a suite of projects, usually by a third-party expert of some sort. We also have different tiers of metrics based on the ease of data collection or analysis. Tier 1 metrics are relatively low effort and easy to measure, while Tier 2 metrics would require additional effort and expertise for data collection and/or analysis. And then the research and development metrics are not fully established and require data that are not readily available. To provide a short list of metrics for consistency, comparison, and rolling up results so that you can look across projects, we identified a set of core metrics for each project category. And these categories are the ones I mentioned previously: habitat restoration, oyster reef restoration, recreational enhancement projects, and water quality projects. These metrics are common across project types, or sometimes across or within a project category, or sometimes across these project categories. The core metrics can be useful for comparing these projects and rolling them up. And lastly, we also have measurement protocols. These are being developed for each project scale metric that is either a Tier 1 or Tier 2. The protocols describe methods for quantifying how much each metric is changed by a restoration project and who has access to the outcome to help us address questions about the distribution and equity of benefits. Next slide, please. You can find all of the resources developed for the GEMS project on the GEMS website. It includes a searchable database of ecosystem service logic models for each project type that identifies all the relevant social and economic outcomes. It includes a database of 44 social and economic metrics at project and program scales that can be searched by outcome of interest, scale, tier, and will also identify whether the metrics are common for each restoration category, those core metrics that I talked about previously. There are a few measurement protocols that are already posted, which can be found in the database as well. These are draft versions. We are going to be rolling out these protocols over the next month or two. In the next month, there's also likely to be funder's guide prepared, as well as practitioner's guides that will be kind of handy little resources that will talk about this information that's on the website and point you to those resources. So those will be posted in the next month as well. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kitty Warnell, who would take you through an example.
Thanks, Lydia. So I'm going to walk through a few examples that will illustrate how you can use the resources that are available on the GEMS website to answer some questions and find metrics relevant for your work. So for this first example, I'd like you all to imagine that you're responsible for developing monitoring plans as part of a Gulf Coast state government agency that does a lot of oyster restoration. And currently your monitoring focuses on the biophysical and ecological outcomes of your project. So things like the area of oyster reef that's restored and the number and size of oysters that are growing on the new reefs. But you're interested in expanding your monitoring so that you would include more of the social and economic outcomes that your project creates. And you've heard that the GEMS resources might be a good place to start for that. So I'm going to switch over to the GEMS website, and you'll use a tool on this website to find the right metrics for your projects. There are two different search tools on the website, but since you're interested in finding metrics for a particular type of project, which are the oyster reef restoration projects, you'll use the search by project type tool. And you already know what types of projects you're interested in, so you can use this project type filter to find just the oyster reef restoration projects from this longer list if you scroll down here. And there are still a few different types of oyster reef restoration projects that show up here. In this case, your agency is primarily investing in these structurally complex subtidal reefs that are not open for intensive harvest. And so we're going to focus on this particular project type. So the first thing you might want to do is expand this outcomes list, and this will show you which social and economic outcomes are strongly linked to your type of project. That means that they're likely to change due to the project, and therefore they're things that might make sense to measure. And if you're looking at this list, you might notice some of these outcomes that you haven't thought of before, and you might not think it's immediately obvious how some of these are connected to your project type. So, for example, if you're skimming this list, you might see mental health and psychological well-being here, and think, that's not an outcome I ever thought of being associated with oyster reef restoration projects. I'm not really sure how that connects back. So if you'd like to see what those connections are, you can take a look at the model. This is the logic model that Lydia described for this type of project. So let's open that quickly in a new tab. So this will pull up the full logic model for this type of project. And what you would do if you want to see how a particular outcome is linked to the project is to find that outcome in the right. All of these yellow boxes here are the social and economic outcomes. So here's the mental health and psychological well-being box. And if you follow the arrows back to see what's affecting that, you see it's a lot of these recreational boxes. So there's recreational harvest of oysters, of non-oysters, so recreational fishing. And there's also a few other types of recreation like kayaking and wildlife viewing. And all of those are activities that your oyster reef restoration project is creating really good opportunities for. And so people are more able to participate in those recreational activities, and that benefits their mental health and their well-being. So switching back to the page we are on, once you finish kind of looking through this list of outcomes and you understand how they're all linked to your project, you can expand this metrics list to see what metrics are available to measure those outcomes. So here's the list of metrics that was identified through the GEMS process. And this is to measure, these metrics are to measure each of these strongly linked outcomes. The metrics list is longer than the outcomes list because for some outcomes, there's more than one metric that we've come up with. And the metrics are categorized here by whether they're project scale metrics or whether they make sense to measure at a larger program scale. At the bottom here, you can click to get more details on this list of metrics. So this will open a new page. This has the same list of metrics we were just looking at in the first column, and then some additional information. So this will tell you what outcome, which of those yellow boxes in the logic model each metric is measuring. Then there's information about tier and scale, which Lydia described. And a description here has a little bit more information about what the metric is actually measuring and what the kind of general methods would be to do that if it requires some kind of field work or surveys, just a little bit of information about that. Then there's a protocols column. So here's where those measurement protocols are linked. There are a few if you scroll down where there's some available for you to look at. And then all the way on the right are these 4 columns that identify core metrics. And we'll look at the core metrics in a little bit more detail in the second example. One thing to note on this page is that there are some filters at the top that you can use to further refine this list. So if, for example, you're only considering metrics that you could suggest for individual projects to measure, it might make sense to only include project scale metrics in your list. So if you click that filter, this will update. And so now it's only showing project scale metrics that are relevant for your project type. And when you're happy with your list of metrics, you can scroll all the way to the bottom and you can click this button to save this as a PDF that you could use to refer to later or for discussions with your team. All right, so that's the end of the first example. So switching back here. For our second example, we're going to think a little bit bigger picture. So here, imagine that you are managing a portfolio of different types of projects, both habitat restoration projects, but also recreation enhancement projects. So things like putting in or improving fishing piers or trails or boardwalks to make it easier for people to access sites. And you'd like to have a standard set of metrics that make sense to measure across all of your different types of projects, so that you can compare the results of those projects and also roll up results to report the impact that your whole program is having. So going back to the website, this time you're thinking about metrics across multiple kinds of projects. And so we'll use this full metrics list page to start. And this page will look really similar to that more detailed page we were just looking at in the last example. But the starting list here is all of the metrics that were developed through the GEMS process. There are 44 of them in total. And again, there are these filters at the top that you can use to refine this list. So since you're interested in finding a standard set of metrics that works across different types of projects, we'll focus on core metrics. There's this little key at the top about the core metrics. So as Lydia explained, during our process, we identified core metrics for each of these project categories. And a core metric is likely to be affected by at least half of the specific project types within the category. So for example, the oyster restoration category has 6 different types of projects. So if a metric is likely to be affected by at least 3 of those, it will show up as a core metric for oyster restoration. Then there are other metrics that are relevant for fewer than 3, but at least one of those oyster restoration projects that would get this kind of striped pattern. And then some metrics would not be relevant to any types of oyster restoration, so they wouldn't be shaded at all. So this key is referring to these last 4 columns here. So you can use this full list just to kind of scroll down and look for core metrics. Since you're really interested in only considering core metrics, I'm going to click on this link to get a little bit more detail and a different view of the table that focuses on core metrics. So this table has, a little bit of explanation at the top, which is basically what I just explained. And then if you scroll down, there are 2 different tables for core metrics. This first table is for project scale core metrics. And if you look for your 2 types of projects that you're interested in habitat restoration projects, so they would have green shading, and recreation enhancement projects. So when we look at this core metrics list, we're looking for metrics that have both green shading and orange shading. So if you look here at this top section, there are these 5 metrics that are core metrics for both of those project categories, and they're actually core metrics for all the project categories. That's why they're kind of separated at the top here. So that's 5. And then if you scroll down a little bit further, there are 6 more metrics here that are core metrics for both of your project categories, even though they're not for all the other project categories. So that's a total of 11 metrics that could be a starting point for you to think about which of these might make sense to measure across all of your projects that could be relevant for both the habitat restoration projects and the recreational enhancement projects. Now, you might also be interested in assessing the cumulative impacts of all of your funded projects at the program scale. So if you scroll further down on this page, the second table is for the program scale core metrics. So it's set up the same way. Again, there's 1 core metric here that's at the program scale that is a core metric for all of the project categories. So it'd definitely be relevant for both of yours. And then there are 3 more core metrics here that are core metrics for both of the project categories that you're interested in. So that gives you a total of 4 program scale core metrics that you might want to consider measuring across all of your projects. One other feature that I want to flag for you in the filters up here is this resilience filter. So if you're interested in thinking about how your projects are influencing specific aspects of community resilience, you can turn on this filter and it will only show you metrics for outcomes that we've identified as being related to resilience. And there's a link here at the top that would take you to a page with a little bit more detail about what that means to be linked to resilience and how those were determined. For the last part of our example today, I'd like to show you what a measurement protocol looks like. So these will help you to think a little bit more in depth about the methods that you would use to actually measure these metrics, as well as the resources and expertise that are needed. And we're in the process of developing protocols for all of our project scale metrics that are tier 1 or tier 2, so not the research and development ones. And there are currently several draft protocols available. One of them is a recreational fishing related metric, which is one that's shown up in all the lists that we've looked at so far. It's a pretty common one across different types of projects. So filtering for that sort of outcome, we find here it is, change in recreational fishing expenditures that are associated with project site visitations, people coming to the project site to fish. So you just click on this protocol link to open it up. And when you first click on these, they'll take you to an overview document. So it's a relatively short document. And it walks you through a little bit of background on the metric itself at the top and the different, just really high level intro to the different methods that are used to measure it. as well as whether these methods involve human subject research that would require some additional kind of thinking through how that will happen. There's a section here that lists the types of coastal restoration projects that that this metric is relevant to. So you can see it's quite a few of all of the ones that we've considered here across the different categories. And then the rest of the document is split into two main components. So we have the how much methods and the who methods. The how much methods explain an approach for how you would quantify a change in the metric, in this case, a change in expenditures on recreational fishing based on the installation of the project that you're interested in. So this section, the how much section, walks you through some different options available for measuring how much recreational fishing activity and expenditures are changing before and after the project installation. So there are three different options for this, and this table just gives you a high-level description of what each of these options would actually measure and how you would go about measuring them. So you can start to get a sense for what they involve and what the differences between them are. So in this case, we've got an intercept survey that you're doing both before and after the project. This is the most scientifically rigorous method. Then there's an option where maybe you couldn't do the before the project surveying, so you only do it afterward. And then the third option here is using other ways to count people fishing other than interviewing them. So using things like photography or counters. And each of these has a link here in blue. And if you click those, you would be taken to a second document with more detail that kind of walks you step by step how each of those methods would be actually carried out. So scrolling down to the who methods, that's our second main part of these measurement protocols. The who methods explain an approach for determining who is being affected by the changes that you're measuring in this outcome. So these help to answer questions like, who is accessing these recreational fishing opportunities and expenditures? What are the barriers to access? Who are these expenditures being distributed to? And is that distribution representative of the populations in the area who either could be or who would like to be benefiting from that? And again, there are a few different options that you could use to answer different parts of these questions. So this table has a high-level summary of them. And then again, if you click on these blue links, you would get to some more details on how to measure each of them. And one thing to note for the who and the how much, there's different sorts of methods that we have. In some cases, there are ways that you can integrate them. So in a few cases, both of them will require the use of survey instruments. And so it's possible to design one survey that answers questions related to both of those sections at the same time. So it just kind of depends on what the actual method is. But in some cases, there's ways to do these things together. All right, I'm going to switch back to our slides and hand it back over to Lydia to set up our discussion.
Great, thank you, Katie. So now we're going to have time to answer your questions about the GEMS project or the tools or metrics that we discussed today and think about how they might be useful for your work. We're going to break into smaller groups to make it easier to have a conversation. And each group will have at least one of the GEMS team members to facilitate and answer questions. So in a moment, you're going to be moved. I hope everyone had a great discussion. I really enjoyed talking to everyone in our breakout. So I wonder if you could put if you haven't yet, is the link, I haven't been watching the chat, is the link to the website already in the chat somewhere?
I did just pop it in there, but let me know if you can't see it, because I know sometimes Zoom does weird things if people weren't in the room at the time. Rachel just put it in again.
Okay, great, just to make sure. So thank you all for joining us today. So if you'd like to learn kind of more about this project and how this information might be able to use, there's a series of webinars that we're having. And so we had one yesterday that's on kind of using this tool for the planning process that talks a little bit more about the logic models. And there's a recording that will be available soon. I'm not sure it's available yet. Rachel, is that uploaded yet?
No, but I can get it up today.
Okay, it'll be up shortly. And then we're going to have one on funding for funders' point of view that's coming up on Monday at 12 p.m. Central, 1 p.m. Eastern. And then we're going to have an overview webinar that'll take place on the 25th of May at 3 p.m. Central Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So if there are other people you think that would like to know about this tool and these approaches, just feel free to share those webinars. The links are going into the chat now, right, with that information. And then lastly, there is a very quick survey that we're putting in the chat, which we'd love for you to fill out. And it's really about kind of your feedback and next steps, like how can we work with you moving forward is really what we're hoping to get out of your answers to that survey so that we can follow up with you as needed to try to kind of get your input and advice as we move forward on this work and see how we can help. Right, is there anything else that I forgot to say that we need to tell everyone before we jump off the call?
Today, can we share emails for direct outreach if people want to get in touch?
Thank you very much, Heather. Right, so can you put in the chat emails for some of the team? My email is on the slide, but it may be easier to get folks from the chat. And feel free to reach out to any of us. We're happy to follow up. Emails everywhere. Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciated the conversation, and hopefully we'll see you at one of our upcoming webinars soon.